with an introduction by the author.
Would you like to hear how the high spirits came about? Ghost stories came into my life before I could read. How well I remember the first one. It was at a party given by my parents, and it was not yet time for me to go to bed because I remember that the sun was sinking outside the windows. And as the guests ate tulip jellies, they were streaked red and yellow and topped with whipped cream of a deliciousness that seems to have departed from the earth, Mrs. Curry told the strange tale of the disappearance of Oliver Lurch. He was a farm youth in Kentucky who had gone out one night from a gathering just like ours to fetch some wood for the fire and had not returned. And when the others went to seek him, he could be heard calling from the sky, "Here I am! Here I am! Help me! Help me! I am Oliver Lurch!" The cries became fainter and fainter, and Oliver was heard and seen no more. There were those who said he had been carried off by a great eagle, but a grown man, what sort of eagle was that? It must have been something else. I fell asleep that night, fearing the mighty clutch. And since then I've always felt that any party would be the better for a ghost story. Although I have read tales of ghosts and the supernatural eagerly all my life, I never thought of writing one until I went to Massey College in the University of Toronto in 1963. The college had a Christmas party for its members and their friends, and some sort of entertainment was needed. There were lots of gifted people to call on, poets and musicians, but I was expected to make a contribution, and I decided on a ghost story, the one which appears first in this collection. For the 18 years I was at the college, a story was called for every Christmas. And here they are, gathered together in the hope that other enthusiasts for this sort of tale will enjoy them. It was never my intention to frighten anyone. Indeed, I do not think that that would have been possible. The audience was too big, and to me at least, terror is best when the group of listeners is small. No, these stories were to amuse and perhaps to add a dimension to a building and a community that was brand new. University College has a ghost of which it is justifiably proud, and undoubtedly there are others around the university campus which have not yet found their chroniclers. But Massey College is a building of great architectural beauty, and few things become architecture so well as a whiff of the past and a hint of the uncanny. Canada needs ghosts as a dietary supplement, a vitamin taken to stave off that most dreadful of modern ailments, the rational rickets. My ghosts are sufficiently traditional in that they all appear in search of something. This is the usual reason for ghostly appearances. Something has been lost, or some revenge or justice is sought, and the spirit cannot rest until this unfinished business is concluded. If that is established, it's obvious that the proper greeting to a ghost is not a shriek of terror, but a courteous, "What can I do for you?" One word remains to be said. I have not changed these stories specifically for this recording. They remain in the form in which they were first read aloud, and I beg you to grant them the attention of the ear, because perhaps, as in my case, your first ghost story was heard. The names of several living people associated in one way or another with Massey College come up in these stories. Never, let me say, are they mentioned in anything except an affectionate and genial spirit, as befits a gaudy night. And I hope that the bearers of these names will not feel that I have been impudently free with them, or suggested an acceptance of the supernatural which they might disclaim. because these are, after all, party ghosts emanating from high spirits.
Revelation from a Smoky Fire. At the outset of a personal ghost story, it is accepted practice to say that one is the least fanciful person in the world, that one has not a nerve in one's body, doesn't believe in ghosts, and can't understand how it happened. I am therefore at a disadvantage, for I am a more than ordinarily fanciful person. I am extremely nervous. I don't find anything intrinsically improbable in the notion of a ghost, and I have a pretty shrewd idea how it happened. Therefore I am more likely to distress myself than to alarm you by what I am going to recount. I know that in the ghost controversy you are all overwhelmingly of the anti-ghost party, but I can assure you that I found it a disquieting experience. The fire in my study smokes. It is not merely that the bursar buys green wood. Something is amiss with the chimney. Sometimes it smokes so much that I feel like those Jesuit missionaries who used to fling themselves on the floor in the long houses of the Canadian Indians, because only within 6 inches of the floor could one breathe the air without tearing the lungs. My fire was smoking yesterday afternoon at dusk as I sat reading the précis of an M.A. thesis. My nerves would have been quieter had I been reading a ghost story. Thesis abstracts are, with a very few exceptions, the least credible and most horrifying productions of imaginative literature. Nevertheless, you will understand that I was not in the least disposed to see a ghost, though I was rather far advanced in asphyxiation. At last, reluctantly, like a man approaching a task he knows to be outside human power, I went to the fire and knelt to poke it, thinking perhaps I might alter the quality of the smoke and thus secure change, if not relief. Of course, I simply made it worse. I grew impatient, and holding my breath, put my head into the worst of the smother to see if anything, a bird's nest or a dead squirrel or anything of that sort, might have stuck in the chimney. Nothing. Defeated, and with the disgruntled resignation of one used to such defeats, I crawled backward into the room and stood up. There was a man sitting at my desk. Nothing in the least alarming about that. People quite often come into my study without being heard. When I am busy, I often do not notice what is happening around me. I assumed he was a visitor. He looked like a senior faculty member, a tall, rather lean, bald man with professorial eyebrows. He was wearing his gown, but so was I, for that matter, for, though smoky, my study was cold. "Good afternoon," I said. "Can I help you?" "You can help me by doing something about that smoking chimney," he replied. He smiled as he spoke, and I assumed that this was some form of donnish humour. Nevertheless, I thought it rather cool of him to complain about what was, after all, my chimney. I decided to take the line of extreme and disarming courtesy, which sometimes works well with impudent people. "I assure you I'm doing the best I can," said I. "Not a very good best," said he. "Take another look up the flue." I obeyed. Not, you understand, because I was awed by him, but because I wanted time to think. Slowly I knelt and poked my head into the fireplace again, and thought, who the devil is he? There's something familiar about his face, but what is his name? I wish I could either forget both faces and names, or remember both. It is this perpetual dealing with nameless faces that makes my life a muddle of uncertainty. Is he one of those architectural critics who still push their way into the college and take on airs? How dare he give me orders? I must have met him somewhere. Is he one of those dons who suffers from the delusion that he is Dr. Johnson and is rude on principle? By this time I had thought all I could without drawing in huge breaths of smoke, so I crawled back into the room and stood up again. "If I were you, I'd go up on the roof and put a rod down that chimney," said the stranger. "Or why don't you come down it again?" "Down the chimney?" said I. Aha, this was the clue. Here, was a madman. "Yes," said he, "you didn't knock at the door, so I assume you must have come down the chimney. You weren't here a minute ago." One of my cardinal rules in life is always to humour madmen. It is second nature to me. I do it several times every day. "Quite so," said I. "I came down the chimney." He looked at me closely, and I thought somewhat insultingly. "Tight squeeze, wasn't it?" said he. "Not in the least," I replied. "A chimney with a good clear draught might be a little swift for a man of my age and quiet habit of life, but this is a superbly smoky chimney, and the smoke, as you readily understand, gives just that density to the atmosphere in the flue which permits me to float down as gently as a feather. Science, you observe." I said this airily, for I was beginning to enjoy myself. "Look here," said he, "I don't believe you're a chimney-sweep at all." "Your perception is in perfect order," said I. "I am not a chimney-sweep. I am the master of this college. Now, may I ask who you are?" "Aha!" he cried. "Just as I thought. You're a madman. I don't believe in humouring madmen. Out you go!" "As you please," said I. He looked as though he might become violent, and I wanted time to edge myself toward the bell which calls the porter. "But before I go, would you have the goodness to tell me who you are?" "I?" he shouted, working the tremendous eyebrows in a way which I could tell had been effective in quelling undergraduates. "Certainly I'll tell you. I am master of this college." "Of course," said I in my silkiest tones. "But which master are you?" "Damn your impudence," he roared. "I'm the 9th master." I confess this made me feel very unwell. I can't tell why, but it did, and although I cannot fully describe the sensation, I thought I was going to faint. For a time my consciousness seemed to come and go in rhythmic waves. It was like vertigo, only more intense. I was horribly distressed, but my visitor seemed even more so. "Stop! Stop!" he cried. "For God's sake, don't fade and reappear like that. You make me giddy." And to my astonishment he fell back into my chair and closed his eyes as white as, as white as a ghost. I forgot all about the porter and hurried to his side. I put out my hand to feel his brow just as he opened his eyes. I was amazed to see unmistakable fear in his face, and he shrank from my touch. "Don't be afraid," I said. "I only want to help you." His voice was faint and came from a dry mouth. "Who did you say you were?" he asked. "I am the first master," said I. Presumably I was distressed more than I realized, for though I was trying to reassure him, my voice sounded sad and eerie, even to myself. "Then you are Finch?" he said. Again the inexplicable malaise overcame me, and I could tell by the fear in his eyes that to his vision I must be fading and reappearing again. My sensations were mingled. To be mistaken for Robert Finch, painter, poet, musician, scholar, wit, and distinguished diner-out, presented me with an extreme of temptation. Should I risk all and bask for a moment in another's glory? But decency prevailed. I denied, reluctantly, that I was Finch. "Good God! Then you must be the other fellow who was here briefly, even before Finch," said he. Condemn me if you will as an egotist, but in such a situation which of you could have contained his curiosity? "What became of him, that other fellow who was here briefly, before Finch?" I asked, and again I heard in my own voice that hollow, eerie note. He shook his head. "I don't really know," he said. "It was whispered that something happened that occasionally happened to professors in those days, something called making a composition with his creditors, or some quaint phrase of the kind. And he went." "Where did he go?" I persisted. The man looked as if he needed fresh air, but the subject was of such importance to me that I put my own interest first. "I don't think anybody knew," he said. "The story that has come down to us is that there was a full dress inquiry in the round room, and it is presumed that the visitor broke the master, for when it was over he stumbled out into the quad, and it was seen that the russet rosette had been torn from his gown. After that, well, some said it was the pool, and some said he
leapt from the tower, and some said—" here his voice thickened with repugnance— "that he went off and got a job at York. The college behaved very well toward the wife and girls. They kept going by, taking in washing for some of the junior fellows who couldn't afford the coin wash. Finch was a man of very delicate feeling, by all accounts, and he saw to it, but it was all so long ago."
My concern for his suffering had considerably abated. Madman he might be, but— "How long ago?" I asked.
"Oh, a century, at least," said he. "Oh, let's see, this is Christmas, 2063. Oh, yes, a full century."
"A century and 9 masters," said I, and again that dreadful sensation like going down too rapidly in an elevator.
"Oh, a distinguished group," said he with complacency. "Let's see, before me, I'm in my 4th year now. There was Kasabovsky for 21 years, poor Sawyers, who died after 3, Taschereau, who made it for 10, Gamble for 12, Meyer for 7, Durashet for 15, poor Poulanier, worn out with waiting, really, for 3, and, of course, Finch's glorious first mastership of 25 long, sunny years. Yes, 9 masters, from the beginning."
I knew I was dealing with a madman. I knew that I was behaving foolishly, but I couldn't help myself.
9, you idiot! I shouted. 10! 10! 10! I was first master!
I stopped, shocked at what I had said, and hurried to change the dreadful word.
"I am first master!"
I screamed. I suppose I must have looked dreadful, waving my arms and shouting, for he shrank back into my chair and covered his face with his hands. But I could hear him muttering.
"It isn't true," he was whispering to himself. "Reason and science, everything I have lived by, are against it. I'm not seeing a ghost. I utterly deny that I am seeing a ghost."
These words affected me dreadfully. I felt as though every fibre and bone of my body were melting into something insubstantial, and my control of myself deserted me utterly.
"Ghost!" I screamed. "Ghost yourself! Ghost yourself!"
But even as I protested, a fearful sickness of doubt was mounting to my heart. I needed help, not for the madman in my chair, but for myself. I pushed the bell for the porter. That way lay sanity. An old army man would know what to do. The porter came faster than I could have hoped. But what a porter! 6'4", of ex-naval man, a bosun if I ever saw one. He went at once to the figure in my chair.
"I heard you shouting, sir," said he. "Anything I can do?" "Get rid of that thing there by the fireplace," said the impostor, pointing toward me, but keeping his eyes closed. "Nothing there, sir," said the porter. "Better let me help you out into the air, sir. Terrible smoky fire you have today."
Nothing there. The words struck me like a heavy blow, and I swooned. How long it was I do not know, but some time later I was aroused to find Mr. McCracken helping me to my feet.
"Better let me help you out into the air, sir," he said. "Terrible smoky fire you have today."
"Yes," I said. "We must ask the bursar for some seasoned wood." Einstein and the Little Lord. I know you will understand when I say it is a great source of satisfaction to me that this college is regularly and extensively haunted. Every part of our great university strives for distinction of one kind or another, but it is everywhere admitted that in the regularity and variety of our ghostly visitations, Massey College stands alone. Year after year our ghosts never fail us, and they are shades of unquestionable intellectual distinction, the cream of the ectoplasm. In this college, so often accused of elitism, our ghosts at least may truly be called the elite of who was who. It is hard not to fall prey to sinful pride when I think of them. Early in January every year I begin wondering, who will it be? Ghosts of worldwide renown think it worth their while to drop in on us for an hour or two, which in the course of a busy afterlife is uncommonly civil of them. As the custom has arisen of celebrating centenaries and anniversaries of all sorts, and lists of these events are published at the beginning of each year, I look down these columns with an interest that comes close to gloating, wondering who our next unearthly visitant will be. Last January there was one prize I coveted above all. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the birth of Albert Einstein. I see in your faces wonder tempered with disdain. What does he think he would have to say to Einstein? That is the question I read in your eyes. But you see, my experience with ghosts has taught me that it is unnecessary to talk to them. Their concern is to talk to you. They have no time for chit-chat. It is true I had some misgiving. If Einstein were to entrust me with post-mortem reflections on the Michelson-Morley experiments, or use me as a means of telling the world a few new things about the wavelength of light emitted by atoms, I should have to be careful not to make any mistakes in taking dictation. But on the whole, I was confident. Only let Einstein come. I would find a way of coping with him. But he didn't come. I waited. By the beginning of December, I began to grow anxious. Had ridiculous pride led me into absurd expectation? Had the other world decided to humble me, to condemn the college to a ghostless year? Of course, I thought, it is not to me, but to the college that the mighty spectres come, and the college has in no way offended. So I waited, as well as I could, for one long December week, and just a week ago tonight my vigil was rewarded. Einstein came. He came unexpectedly, as they always do. It was the night of our Christmas dance, and as some of you know, that is an affair that not merely raises the roof, but rouses the dead. I had stepped out into the quadrangle to rest my ears. Nevertheless, the music was still very loud, and I was not surprised to hear a quiet, slightly foreign voice say from behind me, "Not quite my sort of thing." I turned, and there he was, impossible to mistake. The stout, unremarkable figure, the lamentable clothes, and the large, splendid, melancholy head. He was smoking a pipe, slowly, as a good pipe-smoker does, emitting tiny puffs of fragrance with audible popping of the lips. "You have come," I said. "Oh, I always meant to come," said he. "But I left you till near the end of my centennial year, when I knew I should be tired, because of your rules, you know." What rules, I wondered, but not for long. He meant our rules about college guests. Our unbreakable rule is that no guest may be asked for a favor, and that any informal opinions expressed by a guest must be regarded as confidential. Einstein had come to us to escape the publicity that pursues an eminent ghost. He wanted a rest, and I knew what sort of rest he had in mind. Underneath his arm was a violin. He jerked his head toward the sound of music from the dance, and in a friendly fashion he said, "Come on, we can do better than that." Quite how I followed him I do not remember, but in no time I was in the large room in the basement of my house where the piano lives. I say it lives there because I dare not say I keep it there. I am somewhat in awe of it. You see, I have played the piano all my life without ever having gained any proficiency whatever. Untold gold was spent on my musical education, but I remain a hopeless fumbler. I am perhaps the only man in musical history to play the piano with a stammer. And nevertheless, I play. Almost every day I approach the piano in my basement and endure its Teutonic sneers as I tinkle out the kind of music I like, which I confess is chiefly piano arrangements of music meant for other instruments, and even for the human voice. Einstein gestured me toward the piano and began to tune his violin. It was obvious that his pitch was perfect. I was horrified. "Do you mean you want me to accompany you?" I said, weak with fear. No, we play together, he said, and tucked the fiddle under his chin. My blood ran cold. In all the vast repertoire of music in which the violin and piano can mingle, there is only one piece that I would dare attempt. It is a humoresque by Dvorak, the number 7 in G-flat. You know it. Popular musical taste has accorded words to it, words selected from a well-known railway notice. Passengers will please refrain from flushing toilets when the train is standing in the station. I love you. But when Einstein speaks, who am I to disobey? So I sat at the piano, and to my astonishment I saw on the music desk before my eyes the score of Bach's 6 sonatas for clavier and violin. Einstein made a slight dip with his bow as a signal. My hands flew to the keyboard, and there followed such a flood of exquisite music as had never come out of that piano in its existence. And it was I who was making this glorious sound. Einstein was a pretty good violinist, extremely good for a physicist, but I was a musical marvel. Little by little I took possession of his totally unaccustomed skill. Pride surged through me. I began to refine upon my playing, and to do things properly, which Glenn Gould would probably have foozled. I was like a man transformed, endowed with the power to play music as I had imagined it. Then it happened. There was a sudden discord in the bass end of the piano, and I saw that a gigantic dog had brought its great head down on the keyboard with a crash. Einstein stopped. I stopped. The dog regarded us both with eyes rimmed by nasty, wet, red flesh. "I'm sorry if Dougal has interrupted your music," said a high, sweet, clear voice, "but I really must speak to Professor Einstein without delay." The speaker was the most beautiful boy I have ever seen in my life. His graceful, childish figure was dressed in a black velvet suit and close-fitting knee breeches, from which emerged legs clothed in black silk stockings that Marlene Dietrich might have envied. The velvet suit had a white collar of exquisite lace, and about the handsome, manly little face clustered love-locks of long, fair hair falling in a profusion of curls. You know who it was, of course, and I, from recollections of my childhood reading of the novel of which he was the hero, was able to greet him with a cry which surely fell in familiar and welcome cadence on his ears. "God bless your lordship! God bless your pretty face! Good luck and happiness to your lordship! Welcome to you!" The child bowed in response to my greeting. Modern children do not seem to know his name, or the book by Mrs. Frances Hodgson Burnett in which his story is told. But surely this is a temporary lapse of fame. His romance is undying, a superb realization of what Dr. Jung of Zurich has named the archetype of the miraculous child. Most of you are familiar with him, though there may be one or two among you under 30 to whom he is a stranger. But millions of readers, old and young, have thrilled to the tale of little Cedric Errol, born in New York of an American mother, whom he never addressed or referred to except as dearest, because that is what his English father, who had died so young, had always called her. Cedric considered himself to be an American, and indeed he exhibited all the American characteristics: total candor, boundless self-confidence, naturally fine manners, and a democratic spirit almost too zealous to be wholly believable. But certainly in Cedric there was nothing affected about this democracy. His dearest friends were Mr. Hobbs, the grocery man, Dick, the shoeshine boy, and the poor old woman who sold apples at the street corner. He did good to many others among the poor and needy, for whom his tender little heart was always grieved. Judge, then, of the reader's astonishment when he discovers that this typical little American is, because of the death of a number of relatives on his father's side, the heir of the great Earl of Dorincourt, and that his true name is Lord Fauntleroy. How Cedric softens the hard heart of his grandfather, the Earl, a typical English nobleman, proud, domineering, with blood so blue you could use it for ink, but nonetheless a splendid creature and exceedingly rich, and how Cedric makes all his grandfather's tenants happy, and how Cedric persuades his haughty grandfather to accept Dearest, who, though an American, is nevertheless a lady, and how Cedric gets Mr. Hobbs the grocery man and Dick the shoeshine boy to England and settles them close to Dorincourt Castle so that he can go on being democratic at them. All of this is familiar to you. Familiar also are the drawings done for the book by Reginald B. Birch, which made the appearances of all the characters, but especially the ringleted, velvet-suited little lord, familiar to millions of infatuated readers from 1886 at least until 1925. And there he stood in my music room, confronting Professor Einstein and myself, not only Fauntleroy, but the huge, drooling, red-eyed mastiff Dougal, his grandfather's pet, and the little lord's inseparable companion. I wondered what he had come for, so with a directness which I was sure such a democratic child would appreciate, I put the question. "What have you come for, my lad?" said I. He laughed. It was the characteristic laugh of an innocent child, like silver bells, and it set up an answering echo in the piano.
"I want to ask a favor of Professor Einstein," he said.
"Certainly not," said I. "No guest of Massey College may be asked for favors."
"Oh, please. Oh, pretty please and sugar plums," said Lord Fauntleroy winsomely. "Surely you haven't forgotten that this is the year of the child?"
I had forgotten, in spite of all the newspaper hullabaloo and appeals for this, that, and the other thing to increase the influence of children. I had forgotten. Certainly I had not expected the year of the child to have anything to do with our college ghost.
"The year of the child is more important than rules," said Fauntleroy. "Oh, you'd probably never guess how important for the peace of the world. You know, don't you, that some dear kind people are trying to establish a children's Bill of Rights?"
I admitted that I had heard something of the sort. Einstein didn't bother to answer. He was regarding little Lord Fauntleroy with big, sad eyes, the expression of which I could read. It was an expression of great weariness mingled with a noble compassion. It was also the expression of an influential person confronted with a remorseless beggar.
"That is why I have come for advice to Professor Einstein, the author of Why War," said the beautiful boy. "The best of us want a sensible Bill of Rights. You know the sort of thing. Nobody is to beat children more than is good for them, and savage people are not to eat children, except in case of real necessity, and children are to be loved, except when they are unlovable, and children are to be seen and not heard, except for exceptional children like me, and children are to be taught sensibly by sensible people, and children are to have pocket money, but not enough to make it possible for them to get into serious trouble. And in return, children undertake to be reasonable and pretend to be innocent and believe in Santa Claus and babies being brought by the doctor and all that crap." "Oh, what have I said?"
"You said, and all that crap," said I, wishing to be helpful. Little Lord Fauntleroy was hiding his face in his hands, the very picture of shame.
"Oh, I know I did," he said. "How could I? What would Dearest say if she heard me use such a horrid word? But he makes me do it. It's his terrible influence. Oh, if I were not the sweetest, most forgiving little soul anybody ever heard of, I could hate him."
To emphasize the general grief, the big dog Dougal set up a melancholy howling and lashed the piano keys with his great tail. It was here that Professor Einstein intervened.
"My boy," he said, "if you expect us to understand you, do not begin your story in the middle and wriggle out toward both ends. I recommend the scientific method. State your principal thesis, develop it, and work toward a conclusion."
Little Lord Fauntleroy took his hands from his face and looked at the great man with adoration.
"Just what I wanted," said he. "You are so wise, Professor Einstein. I knew you could help me. I shall do as you say. Please, may I sit on your knee?"
Einstein pondered for a moment and then said, "No." My respect for his wisdom rose sharply.
"Just stand where you are, and I shall sit down, and you shall tell us both, quietly and clearly, what the trouble is. Now, first of all, where do you come from?"
"From paradise,"
said the miraculous child.
"Oh, it's not at all the way silly people imagine. It's really a huge confederation of self-governing paradises where everybody can enjoy eternity with the sort of people they like best. There aren't any grown-ups in the children's paradise, or else it wouldn't be a paradise for children. And, of course, the fact that we're all in the children's paradise makes the other paradises paradisal for the grown-ups."
"Quite true," said Einstein. "I cannot recall ever having seen or heard a child since I entered the
physics division of the intellectuals' paradise. I was troubled by a doubt. "One moment," I said. It has always been my understanding that paradise is for the living who have passed into rest. But you, my lord, never lived. Explain yourself."
"Oh, you dear old silly Billy," said Fauntleroy, putting his graceful little hand on my sleeve as Dougal smeared my trousers with phantom drool. "You, an author of a sort, to say such a thing. You know jolly well that I lived more fully and gloriously than the ordinary run of children. I was loved by millions of people who had no children of their own. We children of literature are the aristocracy of the children's paradise. We are remembered for generations, when the real children who didn't have the luck to live to maturity are forgotten. Poor little mites. We set the tone of the place. In a quiet way, we run it. There are the Dickens group, little Paul Dombey and Tiny Tim and little Nell, and there are the outdoors types, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn and Midshipman Easy and Jackanapes and Penrod and lots of others, and there are the littlest ones like the Bobbsey twins and Budge and Toddy, and there are the fairy tale gang, Rose Red and Snow White and Jack the Giant Killer and all those. You wouldn't believe what a lot there are, and we are all so much more vivid than the flesh and blood children that we naturally take the lead. Or we did," said the boy, his beautiful countenance darkening, "until he came." "A rival?" I said. "Not a rival," said the boy, with what in a lesser child might have been taken for a pout. "A usurper." "Same thing," said I. "Well, let's hear about it." "Everything in the children's paradise was paradisal," said Fauntleroy. "So long as I was the boss, I took care that everybody was happy. I wouldn't tolerate an instant's discord. If any of my agents reported anything to me—" "Agents?" said Professor Einstein. "Spies, do you mean?" "Don't be horrid," said Fauntleroy, smiling his reproach. "Just children who were either naturally very sharp, like the Artful Dodger and Gavroche out of Les Miserables, or else children who were abnormally trustworthy, like Casabianca, you know, the boy who stood on the burning deck. If they saw any trouble brewing, they tipped me off, and I dealt with it at once, and if the child didn't see things differently then, Dougal had a little romp with it, and that always worked." Dougal gave a sudden lurch that almost knocked me off my chair, and I saw what a romp might involve. "Let's hear about the usurper," I said. "You know how things have been on Earth for the past 20 years, said Fauntleroy. "Turbulence everywhere, among nations, among university students, and even among children. In fact, the modern child has simply been going straight to—" Here he blushed deeply and whispered something in Professor Einstein's ear. "And the usurper came from hell?" said Professor Einstein. "No, from Toronto," said Fauntleroy. "His name is Gold-Tooth Flanagan. He's very proud of his gold tooth. He got it by ripping off old-age pensioners in supermarkets until he had enough money to buy it. It was his mark of authority. It is a huge, adult-size gold tooth, but in the worst possible taste. But, of course, that sort of life can have but one end. Gold-Tooth was knocked on the head with a bottle in a police raid in Cabbagetown, and to his surprise he was sent to the children's paradise. Of course, he wanted to go to the hooligans' paradise, but he was too young, so he came to us instead. Nobody's fault but his own. He peaked too soon." "And he tried to take over the children's paradise?" said I. "From the beginning," said Fauntleroy. "He said very offensive things. He started by picking on a literary child from the third world whom we have always known as Little Black Sambo. Gold-Tooth called him a horrid, racist name, and when I rebuked him, gently of course, for he was new and didn't know our ways, he asked me if I was gay. I said of course I was, and the dearest had always loved me for being so gay, and he laughed offensively and mimically, rudely. It wasn't until Holden Caulfield told me what gay means to minds like Flanagan's that I understood that I'd been insulted. Gay indeed. Me? As if for years I hadn't been on a footing of special intimacy with little Miss Muffet. "Didn't it occur to you to put Dougal on him?" said I. "I was coming to that just when the real trouble blew up," said Fauntleroy. "Of course Flanagan sat in on our meetings where we discussed the nature of the child's Bill of Rights.
They were fully democratic, so he couldn't be left out. We were trying to hammer out something along the lines I have already mentioned to you. You see, at United Nations and UNESCO, all the children's business is done by adults who have no idea of what a sensible child wants. The last thing we want is any kind of independence. Make us independent, and we have lost all our power. To deal as we think best with adults, we must be entirely under their thumbs, which is the same thing as being on their backs. Our weakness is our strength. Every child knows that.
This child is wise beyond his years, said Einstein.
Indeed I am, said little Lord Fauntleroy. But Gold-Tooth Flanagan simply didn't know his business as a child. He was agitating for a Bill of Rights that would allow children to vote at the age of 3, and get liquor and dope, and sue their parents for failure to bring them up properly, and ensure that when couples divorced, all the assets were placed in the hands of their children. Such crazy stuff as you never heard of, that would have robbed children of all their real power and loaded them down with a lot of hard work and financial responsibility. So it came to a showdown.
Don't tell me Gold-Tooth Flanagan won, said I.
Well, for the present it is a draw, said Fauntleroy. You see, the meeting became more and more unruly, and finally Gold-Tooth called Christopher Robin a mother. First I didn't think anything of that, because to me a mother means dearest. But a Greek boy out of Aesop's fables was sitting on the platform near me, and he whispered that it was a very offensive expression and meant somebody called Oedipus. So I asked Gold-Tooth to explain himself, and to the horror of everybody he did. Christopher Robin cried, and Alice from Wonderland hit Gold-Tooth with a croquet mallet. And when order was restored, I had to speak very sharply to Gold-Tooth, and he challenged me to a fight. I said I would fight him if Dougal were allowed to be the referee, but he wouldn't have that, and it looked for a moment as if things were going to be very uneven, until Huck Finn slipped something into my right hand, which he said would help, and I very cleverly hit Gold-Tooth when he wasn't looking, and he fell down. But he jumped right up again and shouted, "Foul!" And when I looked at my hand, I saw that Huck had put a horseshoe in it. And then Gold-Tooth attacked me unfairly and without warning, and fought in a way that was utterly un-American and even un-English. And when it was all over, my authority was gone. Here the beautiful child faltered and broke into bitter sobs. Professor Einstein and I exchanged glances. The same thing was in both our minds. With a gentle hand, the great scientist reached out towards the golden curls and removed what was all too plainly a wig. The head beneath had been snatched bald. Little Lord Fauntleroy, at the hands of the unspeakable Gold-Tooth Flanagan, had suffered the fate of Samson.
"Have you tried rubbing it with white of egg?" the great man asked.
"Or perhaps a top dressing of organic fertilizer," said I.
"It will take months to grow to its full length," said Fauntleroy, "and we have no time, unless the horrible plan for a children's Bill of Rights, with which Gold-Tooth Flanagan is at this very moment interpenetrating the brain cells of the Assembly at the UN, is thwarted. Society, as we have known it, must collapse. Children will rule. Can you imagine what that will lead to?"
"I'm not sure that children would do worse with the world than their elders have done," said Professor Einstein. "That would depend on what children," said I. "Take the advice of a man steeped in literature and legend. This is war in heaven, and instead of a defeat in which Gold-Tooth Flanagan is cast down into the pit to howl in torment with all his evil followers, he has achieved dominance."
"Indeed he has," said Fauntleroy. "He's strutting around the children's paradise, flashing his gold tooth and wearing my hair."
"I see that you are right," said Professor Einstein. "Like many childless people, I tend to have an extravagantly high opinion of children." "You must reread King Lear," said I.
"I shall do so," said he. "But meanwhile, my child, do not lose heart. I shall go to the United Nations Assembly, where I still have some spiritual influence, and do what I can."
The face of little Lord Fauntleroy was suffused with a flush of rapture. He rushed to the great man and covered his face with kisses, while Dougal licked Einstein's violin with his huge tongue, making it disagreeably wet. Meanwhile, to be on the safe side, you might try this, said I, taking a small black bottle from beneath the top of the piano.
Oh, you dear old souls, said the wondrous child, his eyes filling with tears. Shall I really regain my hair?
That isn't hair tonic, said I. That is a substance I use for cleaning my piano keys. It is drastic if taken internally, for instance, by anyone who was using it to clean a gold tooth. If I am not mistaken, the child winked at me.
Oh, what a lovely practical joke that would be, he said. Of course, a gold tooth is beyond death, but he is certainly not beyond humiliation.
And then, seizing Dougal by the collar, Lord Fauntleroy and the great dog ran toward the door. Before they reached it, they had grown dim and vanished. Do you really think that children may take over the world? I said to Professor Einstein.
I cannot believe it, said the great physicist. Have I not said that God does not play at the dice with the fate of the universe?
Once again he raised his bow, and off we went into Bach. But because of Dougal's energetic licking, his violin was sadly out of tune. The sound grew fainter, and I was aware of a decline in my own musical abilities until I found myself playing alone, and playing badly. And I knew that yet another ghostly visitation to Massey College had reached its end.
Side 2.
Dickens, digested. In this, the centenary of his death, I should like to speak well of Charles Dickens. The literary world has united to do him honour as one of the half-dozen foremost geniuses of our great heritage of poetry, drama, and the novel. That I should have to stand before you tonight and direct at that immortal memory a charge of— the word sticks in my throat, but it must be given voice— a charge of vampirism repels and disgusts me. But when Dickens has cast this hateful shadow across the quadrangle of Massey College, I have no other course. This is what happened. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. In short, it was the beginning of the autumn term, and the year was 1969. I met the incoming group of junior fellows, and among the 35 or so new men were some who immediately attracted my attention. But the subject of my story was not one of these. No. Tubfast Weatherwax III had nothing about him to draw or hold one's interest. He was a bland young man, quite unremarkable in appearance. Of course, I was familiar with his dossier, which had been thoroughly examined by the selections committee of the college. He came to us from Harvard, and he was a young American of distinguished background, as the dynastic number attached to his name at once made clear. His mother, I know, had been a Boston winesap, but young Weatherwax bore what one politely assumed to be, in Republican terms, a noble heritage lightly, and indeed unobtrusively. He was a student of English literature, and he sought a Ph.D. When I asked him casually what he was working at, he said that he thought perhaps he might do something with Dickens if he could get hold of anything new. I considered his attitude rather languid, but this is by no means uncommon among students in the English graduate school. Hoping to encourage him, I said that I was certain that if once Dickens thoroughly took hold of him, he would become absorbed in his subject. Ah, fatal prophetic words! Would that I might recall them. But no, I, like poor Tubfast Weatherwax, was a pawn in one of those grim games, not of chance, but of destiny, which fate plays with us in order that we may not grow proud in our pretension to free will. I saw no more of him for a few weeks, until one day he came to see me to inquire about Dickens as a dramatist. I'm one of the few men in the university who has troubled to read the plays of Charles Dickens and relate them to the rest of his work, so this was normal enough. He knew nothing about the 19th century theatre, and I told him I thought Dickens' drama unlikely to yield a satisfactory thesis to anyone but an enthusiastic specialist. "And you, Mr. Weatherwax," I said, "did not seem very much caught up in Dickens when last we spoke." His face changed, lightening unmistakably with enthusiasm. "Oh, that's all in the past," he said. "It's just as you said it would be. I feel that Dickens is really taking hold of me." I looked at him more attentively. He had altered since first I saw him. His dress, formerly that elegant disarray that marks the Harvard man, the carefully shabby corduroy trousers, the rumpled but not absolutely dirty shirt, the necktie worn very low and tight around the loins in lieu of a belt, had been changed to extremely tight striped trousers, a tight-waisted jacket with flaring skirts, and around the throat what used to be called, 150 years ago, a Belcher neckerchief. And was I mistaken, or was that shadow upon his cheeks merely the unshavenness which is now so much the fashion, or might it be the first faint dawning of a pair of side whiskers? But I made no comment, and after he had gone, I thought no more about the matter. Not, that is, until the Christmas dance. There are many here who remember our Christmas dance in 1969. It was a delightful affair, and as always the dress worn by the college men and their guests ran through the spectrum of modern university elegance. I myself always wear formal evening clothes on these occasions. It is expected of me. Of what use is an establishment figure if he does not look like an establishment figure? But, somewhat to my chagrin, I found myself outdone in formality, and by none other than Tubfast Weatherwax III. And yet, was this the ultimate in modern fashion, or was it a kind of fancy dress, his bottle-green tailcoat so tight-waisted, so spiky-tailed, so very high in the velvet collar, and so sloping in the shoulders, his waistcoat of garnet velvet, hung all over with watch-chains and seals depending from fobs, his wondrously frilled shirt, and the very high-starched neckcloth that came up almost to his mouth, his skin-tight trousers, and could it be? Yes, it certainly was. His varnished evening shoes were in the perfection of the mode of 1836, a date which had just flashed through my mind, marked the first appearance of Pickwick papers. And his hair, so richly curled, so heaped upon his head, and his side whiskers, now exquisite parentheses enclosing the subordinate clause which was his innocent face. It was, yes, it was certainly clear that Tubfast Weatherwax III had got himself up to look like the famous portrait of the young Dickens by Daniel Maclise. But his companion? No neo-Victorian she. I thought at first that she was completely topless, but this was not quite true. Braless she certainly was, and her movement was like the waves of ocean. As for her Minnie, it was a minissima, nay, a parvula. She was a girl of altogether striking appearance. "Allow me to present Miss Angelica Crumhorn," said Weatherwax, making a flourishing bow to my wife and to myself. "Assuredly she is the brightest ornament of our local stage, but tonight I have tempted her from the footlights and the plaudits of her ravished admirers to grace our academic festivities with beauty and wit. Come, my angel, shall we take the floor?" "Ah, crap," said Miss Crumhorn. "Where's the gin at?" I knew her. She was very widely known. Indeed, she was notorious, but not as Angelica Crumhorn, which I assume was her real name, but as Gates Ajar Honeypot, star of the Victory Burlesque. She was the leader of an accomplished female group called the Topless Tossers. If there is one point that has been made amply clear by the university revolt of the past few years, it is this: students will no longer tolerate an educational institution which professes to stand in loco parentis. Good advice is absolutely out. Therefore I did not call young Weatherwax to me the following morning and tell him that he stood on the brink of an abyss, though I knew that this was the case. It was not that at the dance he had eyes for no one but Gates Ajar Honeypot. In that he was simply like all the rest of us, for as she danced, Miss Crumhorn gave a stunning exhibition of the accordion-like opening and closing of her bosom, by means of which she had won the professional name of Gates Ajar. No, what was wrong
was that when he looked at her, he seemed to be seeing someone else, some charming girl of the Regency period, all floating tendrils of hair, pretty ribbons, modest but witty speech, and flirtatious but essentially chaste demeanour. I saw trouble ahead for Tubfast Weatherwax III, but I held my peace. I thought, you see, that he was trying to be like Charles Dickens. This happens very often in the graduate school. A young man chooses a notable literary figure to work on, and his subject is so much more vital, so infinitely more charged with life than he himself, that he begins to model himself on the topic of his thesis, and until he has gained his Ph.D., and sometimes even after, he acts the role of that great literary man. You notice it everywhere. If you were to throw an orange in any English graduate seminar, you would hit a fetal Henry James, or an embryo James Joyce, Road Company Northrop Frye's, and Halloween versions of Marshall McLuhan are to be found everywhere. This has nothing to do with these eminent men. It is part of the theopathetic nature of graduate studies. The aspirant to academic perfection so immerses himself in the works of his God that he inevitably takes on something of his quality, at least in externals. It is not the fault of the God, not at all. Very well, I thought. Let Tubfast Weatherwax III take his fair hour. He has heard of Dickens' early infatuation with Maria Bednall. Let him try on Dickens' trousers and see how they fit. This meant no small sacrifice on my part. Whenever I met him, I said, as I should, "Good day, Mr. Weatherwax," and then I had to listen to him shout, "Oh, capital, capital, the very best of days, master! Oh, whoop, halloo! God bless us, everyone!" Or perhaps if I said, "Not a very fine day, Mr. Weatherwax," he would reply, "What is the odds, so long as the fire of soul is kindled at the taper of conviviality, and the wing of friendship never moults a feather?" I began to avoid encounters with Weatherwax. The only Dickensian reply to this sort of thing that I could think of was, "Bah, Hamburg," but I shrink from giving pain. But I saw him. Oh, indeed, I saw him crossing the quad, his step as light as a fairy's, with that notable strumpet Gates ajar honeypot upon his arm. Angelica, he insisted on calling her, poor unhappy purblind youth. I longed to speak, but my wiser self, who is, I regret to tell you, a cynical, slangy spirit, whom I call the ghost of experience past, would intervene, snarling, "Nix on the loco parentis," and I would refrain. Even when he came last spring to ask permission to marry Angelica Crumhorn in the chapel late in August, I merely gave formal assent. "I shall fill the little chapel with flowers," he rhapsodized, "flowers for her whose every thought is pure and fragrant as earth's fairest blossom." I repressed a comment that a bridal bouquet of Venus's flytrap would be pretty and original. I prepared the required page in the college register, but August came and went, and as nothing had happened, I made a notation "cancelled" on that page and waited the event. Poor Weatherwax pined, and I ceased to avoid him and began to pity him. I inquired how his Dickens studies went on. He asked me to his rooms in the college, and when I visited him I was astonished to find how Victorian, how like chambers in some early 19th century inn of court, he had contrived to make them. He even had a bird in a cage. Inevitably, it was a linnet. The most prominent objects of ornament were a large white plaster bust of Dickens, very large, positively dominant, and a handsome full set of Dickens works in 25 volumes. I recognized it at once as the Nonesuch Dickens, a very costly set of books for a student, but I knew that Weatherwax had money. He languished in an armchair in a long velvet dressing-gown, his hair hanging over his face, the picture of romantic misery. I decided that, prudent or not, the time had come for me to speak. "Rally yourself, Mr. Weatherwax," cried I. "Marshal your powers, recruit your energy, sir." I started to hear myself give utterance to these unaccustomed phrases, but with that bust of Dickens looking at me from a high shelf, I could not speak in any other way. So I told him in good round Victorian prose that he was making an ass of himself, that he was well quit of Gates ajar honeypot, and that he must positively stop trying to beat Charles Dickens. "Eating your God," I cried, raising my hand in admonition, "cannot make you into your God. Stop aping Dickens, and read him like a scholar." To my dismay, he broke down and wept. "Oh, Good old man, he sobbed, you come too late, for I am not eating my God. I fear that my God is eating me. But bless you, bless your snowy locks. You have sought to succor me, but alas, I know that I am doomed. I rose to leave him, and as I did so, I tell you this knowing how incredible it must seem, the bust of Dickens seemed to smile, bearing sharp, cruel teeth. I shrieked. It was a mental shriek, which is the only kind of shriek permitted to a professor in the modern university, but I gave a mental shriek and fled the room. Of course I returned. I know my duty. I know what I owe to the men of Massey College, to the spirit of university education, to that sense of decency which is one of the holiest possessions of our changing world. And as autumn wore on, it was this autumn just past, but as I look back upon it, it seems far, far away, the conviction grew upon me that Weatherwax's trouble was greater than I had supposed. It was not that he thought he was Dickens, but that he thought he was one of Dickens' characters, and by that abandonment of personality he had set his foot upon a shadowed and sinister path. One of Dickens' characters, yes, but which? One of the doomed ones, clearly, but which? Which? For me, this past autumn was a season of painful obligation, for not only had I to care for Weatherwax, oh yes, it reached a point where I took him his meals and fed him such scant mouthfuls as he could ingest with my own hands, but I had to adapt myself to the only kind of language he seemed now to understand. One day, it was in early November, I took him his usual bowl of gruel and found him lying on his little bed asleep. "Mr. Weatherwax," I whispered. "Nay, let me call you Tubfast. Arouse yourself. You must eat something." "Is it you, grandfather?" he asked as he opened his eyes, and across his lips stole a smile so sweet, so innocent, so wholly feminine, that in an instant I had the answer to my question. Tubfast Weatherwax III thought he was Little Nell. His decline from that moment was swift. I spent all the time with him I could. Sometime his mind wandered, and seemed to dwell upon gates ajar, honey-pot. I never nursed a dear gazelle to glad me with its soft black eye, but when it came to know me well and love me, it was sure to prefer the advances of a fat wholesale furrier on Spadina Avenue, he would murmur. But more often he talked of graduate studies and of that great convocation on high, where the Chancellor of the University confers Ph.D.s magna cum angelic laude on all who kneel before his throne. When I could no longer conceal from myself that the end was near, I dressed his couch here and there with some winter berries and green leaves gathered in a secluded portion of the parking lot. He knew why. "When I die, put me near to something that has loved the light, and had sky above it always," he murmured. I knew he meant our college quadrangle, for though the new graduate library will shortly throw upon our little garden its eternal pall of shadow, it had been, while he knew it, a place of sunshine and of the laughter of the careless youths who play croquet there. Then one drear November night, just at the stroke of midnight, the end came. He was dead. Dear, patient, noble Tubfast Weatherwax III was dead. His little bird, a poor slight thing the pressure of a finger would have crushed, was stirring nimbly in its cage, and the strong heart of its child owner was mute and motionless forever. Where were the traces of his early cares, the pangs of despised love, of scholarly tasks too heavy for his feeble mind? All gone. Sorrow was dead indeed in him, but peace and perfect happiness were born, imaged in his tranquil beauty and profound repose. So shall we know the angels in their majesty after death. I wept for a solitary hour, but there was much to be done. I hastened to the quad, lifted one of the paving stones of the northeast end, where, until the graduate library is completed, the sun strikes warmest and stays longest. For such a man as I, burdened with years and sorrow, the digging of a 6-foot grave was heavy work, and it took me all of 10 minutes. With a little chisel in my handy pocket knife, it was the work of an instant to inscribe the stone, Hic jacet stabilis Weatherwax tertius. And then, as my Latin is not inexhaustible, I continued,
He bit off more than he could chew. It was my intention to place the stone over the grave with the inscription downward, so that no unhallowed eye might read it. Now all that remained was to wrap the poor frail body in the velvet dressing-gown and lay it to rest, or rather, I should be compelled to stand it to rest, for the grave had to be dug straight down. It was only then I raised my eyes toward the windows of Weatherwax's room, which lay on the other side of the quad. What light was that which flickered with an eerie effulgence from the casement? Had I, stunned by my grief, forgotten to turn off the electricity? But no, this light was not the bleak glare of a desk lamp. It was a bluish light, and it seemed to ebb and flow. Fire? I sped up the stairs and threw open the door. Oh, what a sight was there revealed to my starting eyes! My hair lifted upward upon my head, as if it were fanned by a cold breath. The bust of Charles Dickens, before so white, so plaster-like, was now grossly flushed with the colours of life. The none-such Dickens, which had hitherto worn its original binding of many-coloured buckram, was, oh, horror, horror, bound freshly in leather, and that leather, would that I had no need to reveal it, was human skin. And that smell, why did it so horribly remind me of a dining-room in which some great feast had just been completed? I knew at once, for the body was gone. As I swooned, the scarlet lips of the Dickens bust parted in a terrible smile, and its beard stirred in a hiccup of repletion. It was a few days later, last Friday indeed, when a young colleague in the Department of English, a very promising Joyce man, said to me, "It is astounding how Dickens' studies are picking up. Quite a few theses have been registered in the past 3 months." I knew he despised Dickens and all the Victorians, so I was not surprised when he added, "Wonderful how the old wizard keeps life in him. Upon what meat doth this our Charlie feed, that he is grown so great, huh?" He smiled, pleased at his little literary joke. But I did not smile, because I knew. Yes, I knew. The Charlottetown Banquet. The range of guests who come to our fortnightly high-table dinners is wide and provides us with extraordinarily good company. Sometimes we get a surprise, an economist who turns out to be a poet, for instance. I mean a poet in the formal sense. All economists are rapt, fanciful creatures. It is necessary to their profession. Only last Friday we had a visitor whom I found a most delightful and illuminating companion. I shall not tell you what his profession is, or you will immediately identify him, and I shall have betrayed his secret, which is that he's a medium. He does not like being a medium. He finds it embarrassing. But the gift, like being double-jointed or having the power to wiggle one's ears, can neither be acquired by study nor abdicated by an act of will. His particular power lies in the realm of psychometry, that is to say, that sometimes, not always, he finds that when he is near to an object that has strong and remarkable associations, he becomes aware of those associations with an intensity that is troublesome to him, and occasionally psychic manifestations follow. He confided this to me just as we were leaving the small upstairs dining room where we assemble after dinner for conversation and a reasonable consumption of port and Madeira. We were standing at the end of the room by the sideboard, for he had been looking at our college grant of arms. He put his hand on the wall to the left of the frame to enable him to lean forward for a closer look, and then he turned to me, rather white around the mouth, I thought, and said, "Let's go downstairs. It's terribly close in here." I thought it was the cigar smoke that was troubling him. Excellent as the Burse's cigars undoubtedly are, the combustion of a couple of dozen of them within an hour does make the air rather heavy, so I went downstairs with him and thought no more about the matter. It must have been a couple of hours later that I was taking a turn around the quad for a breath of air before bed when I saw something I did not like. The window of the small dining room was lighted up, but not by electricity. It was a low, flickering light that seemed to rise and fall in its intensity, and I thought at once of fire. I dashed up the stairs with a burst of speed that any of the junior fellows might envy, and opened the door. Sure enough, there was light in the room. But now you must understand that we had left the room in the usual sort of disorder. The table had been covered with the debris of our frugal academic pleasures, nutshells, the parings of fruit, soiled wineglasses, filled ashtrays, crumpled napkins, and all that sort of thing. But now I have never seen the room looking as it looked at that moment. How shall I describe it? To begin, the table was covered with a cloth of that refulgent bluey whiteness that speaks of the finest linen. And what is more, there was not a crease in it. Obviously it had been ironed on the table. The pattern that was woven into it was of maple leaves, entwined with lilies and roses. At every place, and it was set for 24, was a napkin folded into the intricate shape known to Victorian butlers as Crown Imperial. At either end of the table was a soup tureen, and my heightened senses immediately discerned that the eastern tureen contained mock turtle, while at the western end was filled with a consommé enriched with a julienne of truffles, that is to say, consommé Britannia. A noble boiled salmon of the Restigouche variety was displayed on one platter, with a vessel of lobster sauce in waiting, and on another was a selection of filets of the most splendid Nova Scotia mackerel, each gleaming with the pearls of a sauce maître d'hôtel. And the entrée! Petite bouche à la reine, a grenadine de veau, and a pique sauce tomate, and none of your nasty bottled tomato sauce either, but the genuine fresh article. There was a lapin sauté, which had been made to stand upright, its paws raised as though in delight at its own beauty, and a charming fluff of cauliflower sprigs where its tail had been a few hours before. You could see that it was served aux champignons, for 2 button mushrooms gleamed where its eyes once had been. There was a côtelette d'agneau, with naturally petit pois. There was a coquette de volaille and a tambal de macaroni, which had been moulded into the form of all things, a beaver. In addition, there were roasted turkeys, chickens, a saddle of mutton and a sirloin of beef, and there were boiled turkeys, hams, corned beef, and mutton cutlets, and it was all piping hot. The flickering soft light I had seen through the window came from a gasolier that hung over the table, and through its alabaster globes gleamed the gaslight, surely one of the loveliest forms of illumination ever devised by man. You have recognized the meal, of course. Every gourmet has that menu by heart. It was the grand banquet in honor of the colonial delegates which was held at the Halifax Hotel in Charlottetown on September the 12th, 1864. This was the authentic food of Confederation. A specimen of the menu, elegantly printed on silk, and the gift of Professor Maurice Careless, one of our senior fellows, hangs on the wall of our small dining room just at the point where our guest, the medium, had laid his hand. Nor was this all. What I have described to you at some length leapt to my eye in an instant, and my gaze had turned to the sideboard, which was laden with bottles of wine. And what bottles! Tears came into my eyes just to look at them, for these were not our ugly modern bottles with their disagreeable government stickers adhering to them, and their high shoulders and their uniformity of shape and their self-righteous airs, as though in the half-literate nasal drone of politicians they were declaiming, "We are the support of paved roads, general education, and public health. We are the pillars of society." No, these were smaller bottles in a multiplicity of shapes and colours. There were the slim, pale-green maidens of Hock, the darkly opalescent romantic ports, the sturdily gay clarets, and the high-nosed aristocrats of Burgundy. There were champagnes that almost danced, yet were not gassy impostors, and they were all bottles of the old shapes and the old colours, dark, merry, and wicked. My knees gave a little, and I sat down in the nearest chair. It was then that I noticed the figure by the sideboard. His back was toward me, and whether he was somewhat clouded in outline, or whether my eyes were dazzled by the table, I cannot say, but I could not quite make him out. He was hovering, I might almost say gloating, over a dozen of sherry. That should have given me a clue, but you will understand that I was not fully myself, and furthermore I had at that instant recalled that the menu given to us by Professor Careless was said by him to have been the property of the Honourable George Brown. On such a matter one does not doubt the word of Maurice Careless. "Mr. Brown, I believe," I said in what I hoped was a hospitable tone. "God forbid that I should cast doubt on any man's belief," said the figure, still with its back to me, "but I cannot claim the distinction you attribute to me." He picked up a bottle of sherry and drew the cork expertly. Then he drew the cork of another and turned toward me with a wicked chuckle, a bottle in either hand. "These are Clan Alpine's warriors true, and Saxon. I am Roderick Dhu," said he, and I was so astonished that I quite overlooked the disagreeable experience of being addressed as a Saxon, for it was none other than old Tomorrow himself. Yes, it was Sir John A. Macdonald, in his habit as he lived, or rather not precisely as we are accustomed to seeing him, but in Victorian evening dress, with a red silk handkerchief thrust into the bosom of his waistcoat. But that head of somewhat stringy ringlets, that crumpled face which seemed to culminate and justify itself in the bulbous coppery nose, that watery, rolling, merry eye, the accordion pleating of the throat, those moist, mobile lips were unmistakable. "If you were expecting Brown, I'm truly sorry," he continued. "But you see, I was the owner of this Minou." He pronounced it in the Victorian manner, Minou. "Brown pocketed as we left the table. It was a queer little way he had of picking up odds and ends. We charitably assumed he took them home to his children. But it's mine, right enough. Look, you can see my thumb mark on it still." But I was not interested in thumbprints. I was deep in awe of the shade before me. I started to my feet. In a voice choking with emotion, I cried, "The father of my country." "Hooky Walker," said Sir John with a wink. "Tuck in your napkin, Doctor, and let's enjoy this admirable repast." I had no will of my own. I make no excuses. Who, under such circumstances, would have done other than he was bidden? I sat. Sir John, with remarkable grace, uncovered the mock turtle and gave me a full plate. I ate it. Then he gave me a plate of the consommé Britannia. I ate it. Then I had quite a lot of the salmon. Then a substantial helping of mackerel. I ate, busily, humbly, patriotically. I have always heard of the extraordinary gustatory zest of the Victorians. They ate hugely, but it began to be borne in upon me, as Sir John plied me with one good thing after another, that I was expected to eat all, or at least some, of everything on the table. My gorge rose. But, I said to myself, when will you ever again eat such a meal in such company? And my gorge subsided. I began to be aware that my appetite was unimpaired. The food I placed in my mouth and chewed and swallowed seemed to lose substance somewhere just behind my necktie. I had no sense of repletion, and little by little it came upon me that I was eating a ghostly meal, in ghostly company, and that under such circumstances I could go on indefinitely. Not even my jaws ached, but the taste, the taste, was as palpable as though the viands were of this earth. Meanwhile Sir John was keeping pace with me, bite for bite, but rather more than glass for glass. He had asked me to name my poison, which I took to be a Victorian jocularity for choosing my wine, and I had taken a Moselle, a fine Berncastler, with the soup and fish, and had then changed to a Saint-Emilion with the entree. It was particularly good with the rabbit, a dish of which I am especially fond. Sir John did not want any, and I ate that rabbit right down to the ground and sucked its ghostly bones. But Sir John stuck to sherry. Never have I seen a man put away so much sherry. And none of your whimpering dry sherries either, but a brown sherry that looked like liquefied plum pudding. He threw it off a glass at a time, and he got through bottle after bottle. You must not suppose that we ate in silence. I do not report our conversation because it is of slight interest. Just Another slice of turkey, my dear doctor. Allow me to give you the liver wing.
And, Sir John, let me press you to a little more of this excellent tambal de macaroni, and may I refill your glass? Oh, you've done it yourself. You know that sort of thing, the polite exchanges of men who are busy with their food.
But at last the table was empty, except for bones and wreckage. I sat back, satisfied, yet in no way uncomfortable, and reached for a toothpick. It was a Victorian table, and so there were toothpicks of the finest sort, real quill toothpicks, such as one rarely sees in these weekly fastidious days. I was ready to put into effect the plan I had been hatching. In the bad old days, before the academic life claimed me, I was, you must know, a journalist. And here I found myself in a situation of which no journalist would dare even to dream. Across the table from me sat one whose unique knowledge of our country's past was incalculably enhanced by his extraordinary privilege of possessing access to our country's future. Here was one who could tell me what would be the outcome of the present disquiet in Quebec, and then how I should be courted in Ottawa. Would I demand the Order of Canada? The companionship, not the mere medal, before I deigned to reveal what I knew, and how I should lord it over Maurice Careless. But I at once put this unworthy thought from me. Whom the gods would destroy, they first make mad. I wound myself up to put my leading question. But poor creature of the 20th century that I am, I was mistaken about the nature of our meal. "Ready for the second course, I think, eh, Doctor?" said Sir John, and waved his hand.
In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, the biblical phrase popped into my mind. The table was completely reset, and before us was spread a profusion of partridges, wild duck, lobster salad, galantine, a plum pudding, jelly, pink blancmange, charlotte russe, Italian cream, a Bavarian cream, a Genoa cream, plates of pastries of every variety, apple puffs, bouchées, cornucopias, croquembouche, flan, strawberry tartlets, maids of honour, stuffed monkeys, prune, fleurie, tortelli. It was bewildering. And there were ice creams in the Victorian manner, vast temples of frozen, coloured, flavoured cornstarch, and there were plum cakes and that now forgotten delicacy called pyramids. And fruit, great towers of fruit, mounting from foundations of apples, through oranges and nectarines to capitals of berries and currants, upon each of which was perched the elegantly explosive figure of a pineapple. You see, I had forgotten that a proper Victorian dinner had a second course of this nature, so that one might have some relaxation after the serious eating was over. But Sir John seemed disappointed. "What?" he cried. "No gooseberry fool? And I'd been so much looking forward to it." He proceeded to drown his sorrow in sherry. I had no fault to find. I began again, eating methodically of every dish, and accepting second helpings of charlotte russe and plum cake. During this course I drank champagne only. It was that wonderful Victorian champagne, somewhat sweeter than is now fashionable, and with a caressing rather than an aggressive carbonization. I hope I did not drink greedily, but in Sir John's company it was not easy to tell. I do not mean to give you the impression that Sir John was the worse for his wine. He was completely self-possessed. But I could not help being aware that he had consumed 9 bottles of sherry without any assistance from me, and that he showed no sign of stopping. I knew, once again I was in the debt of Professor Careless for this information, that it was sherry he had favoured for those Herculean bouts of solitary drinking that are part of his legend. I was concerned, and I suppose my concern showed. Before I could begin my interrogation, might not my companion lose the power of coherent speech? I sipped my champagne and nibbled abstractedly at a stuffed monkey, wondering what to do. Suddenly Sir John turned to me. "Have a weed," he said. I accepted an excellent cigar from the box he pushed toward me. "And a B&S to top off with," he continued. Once again I murmured my acquiescence, and he prepared a brandy and soda for me at the sideboard. But for himself, he kept right on with the sherry. "Now, Doctor," said Sir John, "I can see that you have something on your mind. Out with it." "Well, it isn't very easy to put into words," said I.
Here am I, just as Canada's centennial year is drawing to a close, sitting alone with the great architect of our Confederation. Naturally, my mind is full of questions. The problem is, which should come first?
Ah, the centennial year, said Sir John. Well, in my time, you know, we didn't have this habit of chopping history up into century lengths. It's always the centennial of something.
But not the centennial of Canada, said I. You cannot pretend to be indifferent to the growth of the country you yourself brought into being.
Not indifferent at all, said he. I've put myself to no end of inconvenience during the past year, dodging all over the continent, a mare usque ad mare, to look at this, that, and the other thing.
I could not control myself. The inevitable question burst from my lips. Did you see Expo? I cried.
I certainly did, he said, laughing heartily. And I took special trouble to be there at the end when they were adding up the bill. The deficit was roughly 8 times the total budget of this Dominion for the year 1867. You call that a great exposition? Why, my dear doctor, the only great exposition that made any sense at all was the Great Exposition of 1851. It was the only World's Fair in history that produced a profit. And why was that? Because it was dominated by that great financier and shrewd man of business, Albert, the Prince Consort. If you had any sense, you would have put your confounded Expo under the guidance of the Duke of Edinburgh. No prince would have dared to bilk and rook the country as your politicians did, for he would have known that it might cost him his head. Expo!
And then Sir John used some genial indecencies which I shall not repeat. But, Sir John, I protested, this is a democratic age.
Democracy, sir, has its limitations like all political theories, said he,
and I remembered that I was talking, after all, to a great conservative and a titled Canadian. But now, if ever, was the time to come to the point. We have hopes that our mighty effort may reflect itself in the future development of our country, said I. Because you have been so kind as to make yourself palpable to me, I'm going to ask a very serious question. Sir John, may I inquire what you see in store for Canada? The land which you brought into being, the land which reveres your memory, the land in which your ashes lie and your mighty example is still an inspiration. May I ask what the second century of our Confederation will bring?
You may ask, sir, said Sir John, but it won't signify, you know. I see, Doctor, that I must give you a peep into the nature of the realm of which I am now a part. It is a world of peace, and every man's idea of peace is his own. Consider the life I led. It was one long vexation. It was an obstacle race in which my rivals were people like that tendentious, obstructive ass Brown, that rancorous, dissident ruffian Cartier, even such mutton-headed fellows as Tupper and Mowat. It was a world in which I would be interrupted in the task of writing a flattering letter to an uncomprehending queen in order to choke off some member of Parliament who wanted one of his constituents appointed to the post of a lighthouse keeper. It was a life in which my every generous motive was construed as political artfulness, and my frailties were inflated into examples to scare the children of the grits. It was, Doctor, the life of a yellow dog. Now, what would peace be to such a man as I was? Freedom, Doctor. Freedom from such cares as those. Freedom to observe the comedy and tragedy of life without having to take a hand in it. Freedom to do as I please without regard for consequences.
During this long speech, Sir John had finished the final bottle of his dozen of sherry. Those which he had drunk before had all floated, each as it was emptied, to the sideboard, where they now stood in a cluster. He picked up the 12th bottle and whirled it around his head like an Indian club, closing one eye to take more careful aim.
You ask about the future of Canada, my dear sir, he shouted.
Understandably, you want to tell the world what I know it to be, but you can't, my dear doctor, because I haven't taken the trouble to look. And the reason for that, my dear sir, is that I do not give a damn. And as he uttered these fearful words, the father of my country hurled that last sherry bottle at the 11 on the sideboard. There was a tremendous smash, the gaslight went out, and I lost consciousness. How much later it was I cannot tell, but when I was myself again, I was walking round the quad, somewhat dazed, but strangely elated. For although I had been balked in my wish to learn something of the future in this world, had I not been admitted to a precious, soothing, heart-lifting secret about the next, to be a Canadian, yet not to have to give a damn? Was it not glorious? And to have eaten the Charlottetown banquet in such company. A smile rose to my lips, and with it the ghost of a hiccup.
Side 3.
The Pit Whence Ye Are Digged. On alternate Fridays during the university term, the senior fellows of this college entertain guests at dinner. Some of our guests are junior fellows of the college. Some are people who do interesting things in the world outside. Some are visiting academics to whom we offer the hospitality of the college during their stay in the university. At our last dinner for the present year, that is to say about a fortnight ago, we had 2 visitors of this latter class. One, an eminent Arabic scholar, was Dr. Abu Ben Adem from the University of Alexandria. The other was a Swiss, a Dr. Theophrastus von Hohenheim, from, I think, he said, the University of Basel. He seemed rather a queer customer. There is always a good deal of laughter at our high table, but he never laughed. Instead, he smiled in a disquieting way, as if he saw a joke hidden from the rest of us. Also, he kept looking at his watch, and it was a watch that caught the eye. "That's a handsome watch you have," I said to him, because one must make conversation, and his special subject, which I believe was some sort of physics, was unknown country to me. "Handsome? Indeed," said he. "Very old? Very precious?" He held it up for me to see. It was much larger than a modern pocket watch and beautifully cased in engraved gold. On the enamelled face were many dials. The figures on some of the dials were Greek letters, and others were signs which I knew, because I dabble a little in such things, to be cabalistic. As he held it toward me, he touched a spring, and the watch chimed prettily. Chiming watches are great rarities, and I have never heard one finer than his. I put out my hand to examine it, but he drew it back to himself. Not to play with?" he said, smiling disagreeably. I felt a little snubbed, and turned to talk to another guest. After we have dined in hall, the high-table group goes to the upper library, where we sit around a big table and divert ourselves with port and Madeira and general conversation. Abu Ben Adem and von Hohenheim sat across the table from me on either side of our visitor. He is used to queer customers. They are his stock in trade, and I knew he'd give them a good time. Sitting on my right was one of the young women who are now included among our junior fellows. I know it is considered inexcusably sexist in our time to say that any girl is charming, but it is hard to break the habit of a lifetime. She was charming. She was a lively talker, and I like a girl who has lots to say for herself. Quiet girls, whom some men admire so much, always make me think of clocks that have run down. She was well wound up, and she seemed to regard the college port as a pleasing light thirst-quencher instead of the mover of mountains that it is, and after a glass or two she was almost overwound. The talk on these occasions is often general. We fling remarks and sometimes whole paragraphs up and down the board in good, well-rounded voices. The people who say we shout don't understand academic courtesy. We are simply considerate of those who may be a little hard of hearing. The loudest outcry on this particular night came from Professor Swinton and Professor Wilson. "What are you two roaring about?" cried our visitor, who has himself a voice that dominates courtrooms and makes the boldest felons tremble. "About Scotland and the year 1974, shouted Professor Wilson. 1974, the year that has seen the Scottish nationalists on the march. And what better year for that? Is it not 700 years precisely since the birth of Scotland's mighty king and liberator, Robert the Bruce?" "Oh, you're daft," cried Professor Swinton. "Robert the Bruce was well enough in his small way, but this year is a far greater anniversary in the history of Scots culture and imperialism. For was it not in 1774 that the great Henry Duncan was born?" "And who might Henry Duncan be?" asked our visitor. Professor Swinton looked aghast. "Oh, man, I despair of ye," said he. "Was not Henry Duncan the founder and deviser of the Savings Bank? And has not Scotland ever since dominated the earth through the gentle, ameliorating, civilizing influence of the Savings Bank?" "Hoot-awa!" shouted our librarian from down the table. "Scotland's poets are her glory, and let me remind you that Gavin Douglas was born 5 centuries ago to the year." When Scotsmen are in full cry, they must be resisted. Professor Lepin threw himself into the breach. "Well, I'm not ashamed to say that I've never heard of Gavin Douglas," said he, "but I remind you that a very respectable, if not positively a great poet, was born in 1774, and that was Robert Southey." "Southey!" shouted the librarian with Caledonian, nay, Nova Scotian contempt. "Southey? Can you not do better than Southey?" "Yes," said Professor Lepin. "Oliver Goldsmith died in 1774. He popped out just as Southey popped in. And Robert Herrick died in 1674. So there." The librarian uttered a wordless jeer. It was a Scottish sound, rather like a power saw striking a knot. "You had to take refuge in deaths," he triumphed. "Deaths will avail ye nothing." The rest of us rallied as well as we could to Lepin's defence. Our expert on Canadian literature is Dr. Claude Bissell. "What about Robert William Service, the Bard of the Canadian North, born in 1874, he cried, and launched at once into, a bunch of the boys were whooping it up in the Malamute Saloon. The kid who tickles the ivories was hitting a jagtime tune. But he was overcrowed by a roar from Professor Stacey. "If you talk of Canada, try this if you can. Who was born on the 17th of December, 1874? You don't know? Of course you don't know, but I know. It was William Lyon Mackenzie King. That's who was born on December 17th, 1874. Mackenzie King didn't write any poetry," said Dr. Bissell, who wanted to get on with the shooting of Dan McGrew. "Oh, yes, he did," shouted Professor Stacey. "It's not widely known, but I know it. And I'm bringing out a fully annotated edition of the collected poems of William Lyon Mackenzie King, including his 5-act blank-verse drama, The Happy Conscript, within the next 20 years, so all the rest of you, keep your paws off it." "Well, you're welcome to your Mackenzie King," shouted Professor Careless, who was late to get into the scrap, but the more valiant because of it. "King wasn't the only Canadian poet to be born in 1874. In 20 years, I'm bringing out the collected poems of Arthur Meehan, including his mighty Ode to Coalition Government. Then we'll see who was the better man." It was the moment for the voice of reason, of taste, of moderation and civilization. And, of course, it came from Professor Finch. Allow me to remind you," said he, "that apart from the lesser figures you mention, this year marks the 4th centenary of the birth of Prosper Joliot de Crébillon, an ornament of a great civilization." The librarian began a mocking chant. "Dirty books, Finch only thinks about dirty books." Pardon me, said Professor Finch, with that perfection of high-bred scorn and unruffled temper which is peculiarly his own. I presume you, Mr. Librarian, are thinking of the son, Claude Prosper Joliot de Crébillon, whose witty novel Le Sofa might seem risqué to a Calvinist mind, coarsened by the lewd rhymes of the exciseman Burns. But that was Crébillon fils. I was speaking of the dramatist, Crébillon père. It seemed to me that the conversation was growing rather too warm. I sought to cool it. Now, one of my disabilities as master of this college is that I really don't know much about anything, but I am paid part of my salary because of a pretense that I know a little about the theatre. I fished in the dank tarn of my memory for a cooling fact and came up with a beauty. If you don't mind another pair of deaths, I said, the world of popular entertainment lost two of its brightest luminaries just 100 years ago. But I was not to have things all my own way. I never am. Of course, one of them was William Henry Betty, the young Ruscius, who died on August 24, 1874, said Professor Jacques Berger with an unconvincing affectation of carelessness. I was directing a look of scholarly rigour toward him when Professor Hume struck in. I don't know why you worry about theatrical deaths when 1874 was the birth year of both Harry Houdini and Lillian Bayliss, said he. I was furious, but I smiled as sweetly as any Finch. I only wish to draw attention to the death in 1874 of the original Siamese twins, Eng and Chang. I supposed its biological interest might appeal to you. But irony is lost on scientists who have just speared a humanist and beaten him at his own game. While this was going on, my young companion on my right had been getting rather heavily into the port, and the academic world was undulating before her in its brightest colours. Oh, it's all so, romantic, she cried. I just love olden times. Oh, I wish I could make a journey backward in time. I know I'd be somebody fascinating. I've sometimes thought that I'm a reincarnation of one of those marvelous women of an earlier day. One of those mistresses, they called them then. We all turned to her with looks in which pity and dismay were mingled. She was a clever girl. I won't tell you what she was studying, but it was one of the really clever subjects. She had a blazing array of marks and prizes, but it is precisely these clever people who reveal a very soft core when the port engulfs them. It was Dr. von Hohenheim who pounced. "You ready, Wish, to journey back into time?" said he. "Oh, yes, I do. You see, I have this very, very, very strong conviction that I'm a reincarnation," said our young guest. Dr. Abu Ben Adim struck in. Do be very careful, I entreat you, said he. We are all reincarnations, but of course we are simply reincarnations of our own forebears. Travel backward in time, and you will only find yourself your own great-great-great-great-grandmother, or somebody of that order. "Oh, but I'm sure she must have been somebody wonderful," shouted the girl. "Marie Antoinette, or somebody like that. I've always understood there was French blood in the family." "That might very well be," said Dr. Swinton unexpectedly. "There was a friend here says it's a wise child that knows its own father. How wise does a child have to be to know its own great-great-grandfather?" "I'd love to know," cried the girl, who was now in a high state of excitement. "I'd love to go back to 1774, for instance, and see who I was." She saw the doubt on my face and shook me by the arm. "Think how it would be, all that graciousness and politesse and lovely clothes and lots of servants and things." I was about to suggest that one of the other ladies present take her out for a brisk walk around the quad in the cold air. But to my dismay, Dr. Theophrastus von Hohenheim rose to his feet, dominating the table. "It can be managed," said he calmly, and took out his beautiful watch, which he held aloft. "Be as thou wast wont to be, See as thou wast wont to see," he intoned solemnly, and then he pressed the spring, and the watch chimed so sweetly, so melodiously, that I have always been sensitive to music, thought I lost consciousness for a moment. And when I opened my eyes, what a scene confronted me. Oh, for the pen of my great master Ernst Theodor Amadeus Hoffmann to describe what I saw. It was our upper library still, and our table was the same. Our company was the same too, but we were all in the dress of 1774, and we were all, I knew it with sickening conviction, our great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfathers or grandmothers of that time, though which of the 128 possibilities I could not, of course, tell. That's where chance comes in, I thought to myself. And what a crew we were! It was pleasant enough for some. There at one end of the table Professors Swinton and Wilson were still disputing, but now they were the great Swinton of Swinton, arrayed in the height of Edinburgh elegance, and in the splendid panoply of a Highland chieftain, Wilson of Gun. I had occasionally heard Jock Wilson spoken of by his envious colleagues as a son of a gun, but I never felt the truth of it till that moment. They were still deep in a haggle about Scottish nationalism, for time had made little difference to them. They looked like portraits by Raeburn, and gave a lustre to the room far warmer even than the candlelight. The librarian, too, was still obviously a librarian, though he had no beard, and wore a wig that had seen better days. On his left arm was a black band, and I heard him explaining to his neighbour that it was mourning for the Scots poet Robert Ferguson, who had died a few weeks ago on the 16th of October, 1774. "The name of Ferguson will never die," he declared, and Dr. von Hohenheim, who was in an ominous suit of unrelieved black, murmured, "No, never so long as it is linked with the name of Massey." My eyes roamed round the table. A stunning figure was Professor Baines. Always the most fashionably dressed of our senior fellows, he was now obviously Beau Baines, the darling of Bath society. But our bursar, what was he? Bearded to his waist and swathed from head to foot in heavy, uncouth garments, with huge felt boots upon his feet, a Russian mujik in every detail. He was gazing across the table with extreme bitterness at George Ignatieff, the provost of Trinity, who was our guest that evening. Ignatieff, like Friesen, was heavily dressed, but with what a difference! The sables and velvets of a Russian boyar enwrapped him, and upon his head was a fur hat so immense that it might have broken the neck of a lesser man. He was drinking port straight from the decanter, and when it was empty he flung it with aristocratic nonchalance against the wall. But he was not silent. I gathered that he was attempting to secure a vast loan from a figure at his side whom I recognized as a forebear of Professor Abraham Rothstein, who was looking at his superb neighbour with the subtlety and amusement of an economist who knows financial innocence when he meets it. And who were those unhappy creatures at the other end of the table? That Scotsman, for he could be nothing else, almost naked except for a much-worn plaid, and bearing every mark of crushing poverty. Could it be Walter Gordon? Yes, it was, and he was discussing the prospect of emigration to the New World with a figure who was so swathed in bandages that for some time I did not recognize him as Dean Safarian. He was explaining the intricacies of a recent difference of religious opinion his people had been having with the Turks. He said that as soon as he was fit to travel, he, too, was going to America. These two were agreeing that to live in subjection to a master race was hell indeed. Nor were they the only ones who were talking of oppression. There was Robert Finch, even more elegant in the 18th century than in this. You never saw such a wig, assuring Professors Stacey and Careless that any talk they had heard about imminent revolution in France was utterly without foundation. It was propaganda, he said, put about by people who did not understand the rock-like unshakability of the French throne. But Stacey and Careless were not wholly convinced. Stacey, obviously a Tory of the darkest blue, was becoming very angry with Careless, whose less formal dress suggested some revolutionary sympathies. He insisted that revolution in the American colonies was no more than a few months away, but Professor Stacey would have none of it. "Sir!" he roared, and I could tell by his form of speech that during some recent visit to London he had fallen much under the influence of Dr. Samuel Johnson.
Sir, I perceive that you are a vile Whig. The terms in which you speak of the man Jefferson must stand among the rankest effusions of encomiastic adulation.
Sir, countered Professor Careless, your praise of King George is hyperbolical cant, but as it springs from ignorance rather than malignance, I forgive you, and I'll trouble you for the port, if that Russian hasn't drunk it all.
Liberté, égalité, fraternité. Quelle blague,
said Professor Finch. Perhaps I had better say the Abbé Finch, and laughed musically while getting the port first. Professor Lepin, I saw, was chasing a squirrel out of the plate of nuts, a squirrel that Jacques Berger, a zoologist even in the 18th century, carried about in his pocket. The noise of conversation was high. Two notable divines, the Reverend John Evans and the Reverend Northrop Frye, were hard at it. Dr. Evans defending the doctrine of salvation through works, the works one could grind out of others, while Dr. Frye was urging salvation through the refiner's fire of an exacting criticism of Holy Writ. A conversation on the fine points of agriculture was in progress between two obviously successful farmers across the table. Farmer Wells, who looked and dressed so much like John Bull that he might have stepped out of a drawing by Rowlandson, was arguing intently with Farmer Bissell, Capability Bissell he was called, because of his proven power of making two blades of grass grow where only one had grown before. Farmer Hume was fast asleep, his napkin covering his face, and from beneath the table appeared a pair of glittering top boots, the property of Beau Baines, who seemed to be resting there. Everybody was talking, except von Hohenheim, who glanced in every direction in an ecstasy of malicious pleasure, and Abu Ben Adam, who was wrapped in his Mussulman's robes, and being debarred by the Koran from drinking any port, was doing his best to eat all the dates on the table. Everybody was talking, and everybody was behaving in a manner which I felt certain was characteristic of the 18th century. It wasn't bad, except that several people scratched themselves more often than is usual in modern society, and those who wore wigs were apt to remove them from time to time in order to mop the perspiration from their close-cropped heads. There were quite a few gouty feet, and one or two wore spectacles of the Ben Franklin sort. Finch, needless to say, had a quizzing glass. And, of course, there was the spitting. Everybody spat, more or less, and now and then some of them, those from the eastern parts of Europe, blew their noses in a fashion rarely seen nowadays except in lumber camps. They had handkerchiefs, but their purpose appeared to be ornamental. It was the spitting which took my eye, figuratively and once or twice in actuality. The two American gentlemen, Stacy and Careless, were the great proficients in this art, and they spat, as was the polite custom of the day, over their left shoulders, rapidly and with a truly American force and efficiency. It is hard to see someone spit without wishing to spit oneself, so I spat, and that was when my own great revelation struck me. The Americans, as I said, spat briskly, with a positively musical brio, but when I spat, I let my head fall forward, spread my feet, opened my mouth, and allowed gravity to take its course. Then I ground the result into the carpet, slowly, and, as it were, compassionately. And as I did this, I knew what I was, what the 18th century meant to me, what 1774 revealed of me. I had been aware, as I gazed about the table, of a heaviness in the atmosphere. The air seemed infected with a woolly greasiness. I had assumed that it was Dr. Abu Ben Adam, who, like so many Arabs, was said to rejoice in oil. But I now perceived it to be the smell of lanolin. Not lanolin as you buy it for medical use, but as it exists on the unwashed wool of sheep. Now I knew that this smell came from myself. I was clothed from neck to knee in a homespun smock-frock, and about my shoulders was a sheepskin of venerable age, presumably as a defence against rain and mist and the damp of the Welsh hills, because, you see, I was a simple Welsh shepherd, marked and ingrained with the consequences of his calling. Upon my head was a hat of incalculable antiquity, such a hat as Adam may have worn after the fall,
and my feet were warmly but untidily cased in more wool and gigantic greased boots. My hands were covered in tar, the tar shepherds use against that ovine disease, the foot rot. And I had just spat, as Welsh shepherds always do spit, with minimal effort, but with a primordial splendour that had something religious about it. It was thus, doubtless, that the shepherds spat on that notable occasion which we celebrate here, when they abode in the fields, keeping watch over their flocks by night. I was roused from these reflections by a voice I knew in the very marrow of my bones to be a voice of authority, the voice of my betters. It was Dr. John Evans, and to any Welshman of the rank in which I found myself, the voice of an Evans, of Ysbyty Ystwyth, is like the music of the harp. "Tu alt, Muslim," said he, but the words fell upon an uncomprehending ear, and he saw what the trouble was, pointed at the wine bottle, and spoke again. "Brenin I pen biliaid," said he, and the cruel words of abuse had an age-old familiarity. I passed the drink at once, bowing, cringing, and rubbing the mouth of the bottle with my greasy sleeve as I served the gentry. But inwardly I was stricken, though I seemed to comprehend through my vision what others were saying, or were likely to be saying in English. Not one English word could I utter. "Arun waith yikida me raglau," said I to Dr. Evans, bowing obsequiously. But he waved me aside, as he had every right to do, him, a great man of education, and me, the humble shepherd of the flocks. But I glared across the table at that villain von Hohenheim, and muttered a curse in Welsh that made him wriggle in his chair, mighty magician though he was. But mine was not the worst case. What of the poor girl who had held such high hopes of the 18th century, who had talked so innocently of its graciousness, who had been certain that in that bygone time she would have been a mistress, and a scented, pampered mistress of royalty, no less? She was padding about the table in her bare feet, a single ragged garment tied around her waist with a dirty string, her hair in filthy disarray, and in her hand a bunch of what I took to be weeds. But it wasn't weeds.
"Won't you buy my pretty lavender 2 bunches a penny?" she sang in a voice coarsened with gin. But there was a glance in her eye that made it clear that lavender was not everything she sold. Some of the men waved her away, others gave her extremely small coins, which they found in the depths of their pockets. Swinton of Swinton pinched her behind, but perfunctorily, as if it were a social duty rather than a pleasure. Nobody seemed to want to buy anything at all. My heart wept for her. But yet, I thought, even from Gin Lane in the 18th century, the modern Ph.D. may arise. I took a deep breath of hope, and immediately wished I hadn't, for the warmth of the room was working powerfully on my sheepskin. At no time did the girl approach me, but as she passed, my heart yearned toward her in pity. I hooked her to me with my crook, and blessed her. "Bendit your arglwyd putain fech," I cried as tears started from my eyes, but she utterly mistook my words and my intention. "Not for 20 golden guineas," she said, drawing her poor garment about her with pathetic pride. I had little time to grieve over this misunderstanding, for I heard a familiar voice at my elbow. It was the college steward, putting his usual question at this time of the evening. "May I blow out candles?" he asked, and I nodded assent. I knew that it would do nothing to untangle the complexities of the evening to address Miroslav Stojanovich in Welsh. Slowly, ceremoniously, he extinguished each candle. In that brief moment when all the candles are out and the electric lights have not yet been put on, I heard von Hohenheim's chiming watch, and, you must believe me, it was playing the same tune as before, but playing it backward, as Bach sometimes reversed a subject in counterpoint. And as it played, I recovered myself, and the English tongue, completely. In the clean new light, I turned to the girl beside me and said, "Will you have some coffee, or perhaps a little cognac?" She, too, was quite herself, her 1974 self, now. "Cognac every time," said she. As I went to fetch it for her, I found myself next to the unspeakable Dr. Theophrastus von Hohenheim. He smiled darkly at me, and flung me a quotation from Scripture. "Hearken to me, ye that follow after righteousness, ye that seek the Lord. Look unto the rock, whence ye are hewn, and to the hole of the pit, whence ye are digged. I am unfailingly polite to college guests. Isaiah 51, reading from the first verse, said I, smiling serenely. But he won't be asked again.
Side 4.
Offer of Immortality.
Many of you who are here tonight have heard several of the Massey College ghost stories, and there are some who have heard them all, and all of them true. Yet I have never felt justified in taking the ghosts for granted. I have never dared to think, oh, one pops up every year and it's sure to appear on time. Ghosts do not like to be taken for granted, just as they do not like to be given orders. You will understand why I was uneasy. This is my last year as master of Massey College, and I should have liked to round out my time here by telling you of yet another ghost. However, 'tis not in mortals to command success. I have no ghost for you. However, there was something, circumstances of which I ought to inform you, though when you have heard them, you will understand my reluctance in making them known. Not a ghost, no, but something not quite in the common run of affairs. Oh, that I had the resolution to stop now, to say no more, but here it is. It happened at the end of November, when we held our last high table for this year. We don't have high tables in December because the college dance and this affair are our offerings of hospitality during the Christmas season. Hospitality! It is one of the guiding lights of this college. Every honor, every consideration for our guests. That is our somewhat old-fashioned principle. A guest here is sacred. On the Friday afternoon, when we were getting ready for high table, Miss Whalen received a telephone call from Dr. Walter Zing, the distinguished medical scientist and a senior fellow. I hope it won't upset the arrangement of the table too much, said he, but I should greatly like to bring a visitor who has arrived unexpectedly from South America, a scientist of international renown from Bogota, Professor J.M. Murphy. Well, that was easily arranged, and when the list of guests was being prepared, Miss Whalen discovered that the university from which Professor Murphy came was founded in 1572, which makes it substantially our senior, and that it must also be one of the most exalted universities in the world, for it stands 9,000 feet above sea level. But when she finally ran the professor down in an academic directory, it said only that he was a world leader in cryonics, and that his full name was Jesus Maria Murphy. This did not trouble me. South America is full of the descendants of Irish immigrants who retain their Irish names, although they are now almost wholly of Spanish and Indian blood. Jesus Maria Murphy would cause no more raised eyebrows in Colombia than such a name as Mackenzie King Stacy might in Canada. I didn't know what cryonics was, but I didn't need to know. Professor Zing would take care of all that. I was not prepared, however, for the figure who appeared in the senior common room under the wing of Dr. Zing. I say under the wing advisedly, for Professor Murphy came no higher than the doctor's waist. He was the tiniest human being that I have ever seen, but that was not the only thing that gave him an air of unreality. His complexion was so rich in color, and his hair was so glossily black that he looked like a beautifully made doll. Hair dye and an almost operatic amount of makeup, strange in an academic, but these are permissive times. When I took his hand, it was like a tiny claw and extraordinarily cold, so cold I almost dropped it in surprise. When I am disconcerted, I take refuge in extreme heartiness and good fellowship, which, as most of you know, is no indication of my true nature. That is what I did when I felt that cold, cold hand. "Welcome, Professor Murphy!" I roared. "What good fortune for us that you are able to dine here tonight!" He responded with what I suppose he meant for a reciprocal exuberance. In a thin, high voice, very much like Punch in the puppet shows I used to see in London, he replied, "That's what you think, eh? Lucky for you, eh? Just luckier than you know." I introduced Professor Murphy to some of the others who had assembled for dinner. Quite without self-consciousness, he skipped up on top of the table and stood there, so as to be able to address them face to face. When an opportunity came, I looked inquiringly at Professor Zing. He was blushing. "Never saw him before," he said. "I have to take care of him over the weekend, keeping off big dogs and mean children and that sort of thing." "The professor looks to me as if he knew how to look after himself," said I. Certainly he had no trouble at dinner. With that exquisite courtesy for which Massey College is famous, our librarian had seen that 3 volumes of the Oxford English Dictionary were on his chair, so that he would be at no disadvantage, and there he sat, perched on N to poi, chattering away happily to Dr. Swinton, a man with an insatiable appetite for scientific curiosities. On Murphy's other side sat Professor Hume, the master designate, and I knew that those 2 experienced hands at college hospitality would take good care of our strange guest. But I noticed that although he chased our good dinner round his plate with his knife and fork, he ate nothing and drank no wine. Our steward, Mr. Stojanovich, appeared beside my chair. "That little gentleman, that Professor Murphy, asked if he might have some of his favorite drink." "Well, certainly, if we have it," I said. "We have it," said Mirsha. "It is vinegar." "Give him the best we have," said I. An odd request, I thought. Vinegar is, of course, a solution of acetic acid, made, as the dictionary explains, from inferior wines. Canada, which yields place to no country in the world in the production of inferior wines, has first-rate vinegar. Mirsha returned, bearing a demijohn, which he showed me in the distinguished manner that adds so much to college functions. I took a little in a glass and rolled it thoughtfully over my palate. It was a rich, full Loblaw 1980. I nodded approvingly. Our guest was served, and I was interested to observe that he smacked his lips, and after 2 quick glasses showed an increase of his former lively spirits. Nor was that the end of it. When we went downstairs for more conversation and wine, Professor Murphy insisted that the vinegar jug go with him, and he nipped away all evening, consuming more in liquid volume than any 4 of the rest of us. This was eccentric, certainly, but nothing more. However, when we were parting for the night, the strange guest seized me by the hand and hissed, "I must talk to you." "If you wish," I said. "I'll ask Professor Zing to bring you into my lodgings." No, said little Murphy. "Get rid of Zing. Tell Zing to go hang." As Professor Zing was standing right beside him, this was rude. But Professor Zing is not a man to lose his dignity. He smiled courteously at Jesus Maria Murphy, bowed very slightly, and left the room. But I thought there was an air of relief in his manner. In no time at all, I found myself sitting in my study, facing Professor Murphy, who was curled up in my big chair with his 3rd demijohn of vinegar, freshly opened, sitting on the floor beside him. A hospitable thought struck me. Would you like to use the plumbing?" I asked. After all, the law of gravity dictates that so much liquid intake must at some point impose this necessity. "Use what?" he hissed. Oh, the excusado. No, never go. Foolish. You shall find out why." I can't say I like the sound of that, but the professor was hurrying on. "Hey, you, Davies, you old man now, eh? You getting out of here? They kick you out, no?" "Decidedly no," I said, with some austerity, for I did not like his tone. "I am retiring, and the college has shown me every courtesy, as is its custom." Yeah, but you sorry to go. You want to know what's going to happen, eh?" "Well, naturally I do. I am the first master of this college. I hope the first of a long and splendid line.
Not to be curious about the future would be impossible, though I know how ridiculous any such desire must be.
Why ridiculous?
Well, because of the brevity of human life.
Not brief at all. You're not a scientist, huh?
No, said I. Insofar as it is possible to sum up what I am a student of literature, with a psychological bias.
Oh, Holy Mother of God,
said Professor Murphy.
How you people spend your time. Still, I was just such an idiot when I was your age. A few 100 years ago, I was even a priest. Our university was started by priests way back in the days of the Spanish conquest. I was one of the founder and sub-rector for many years. But it's not easy to be a Spanish priest in the South American mountain. Not if you have any real intelligence. Not if you see what is right under your nose.
I thought it better to humor this madman. Was he really claiming to be something like 450 years old? So you became an unbeliever, I said.
Oh, never. Unbelievers are fools. Worse than unilluminated believers. I became an illuminated believer. I expanded my realm of belief. I became an alchemist.
An alchemist, said I. Making gold and that sort of thing?
Pah!
He said, and a good deal of saliva sprayed across the room at me.
I spit on gold. In South America, it's gold everywhere, kicking along the ground. No, I studied life. And as time went on, and science began to lift its head above the rubbish of faith, the illumination came, and by the middle of the 19th century, I was one of the earliest biologists.
Is it widely known that you have had such a long and interesting life? I said.
No, better not, said he. I changed my name from time to time. Give up being priest, though I am still a good Catholic. But that's why I'm now Murphy. Lots of Murphys in Colombia. I can speak Irish. Huh? Bigora. May your shadow never grow less. Devil take you, damn your eyes, Mother McCree. Yes, and now I am Professor Murphy, and head of a very big scientific section in our university.
And what brings you to Canada? I said.
I am scouting for candidates,
said he, looking at me with extreme cunning. For your faculty, said I.
No, for my Instituto Crionica da Colombia. But we have strayed. We talked about your curiosity regarding the future of this college. There are lots of ways of finding out, you know.
Such as, said I.
Well, gematria, for one,
said he. Gematria, the Kabbalah of numbers. How often had I not heard of it, that elaborate, ancient, but surely mad science of divination practiced so long by the Jews, and part of the structure of their medieval scholasticism. I looked at Murphy with new eyes. But surely gematria is known only among the Jews, said I.
If you live long enough and survive strongly enough, the Jews begin to think you must be one of themselves, and they tell you secrets,
said Murphy.
You want to know how gematria works?
Of course I did.
Then you must understand that numbers are the most important things under heaven. All is number, and God is the God of numbers. I suppose you know Hebrew, eh?
I've allowed it to grow a little rusty, I said, but I used to be able to read and write it pretty well.
Then you know that in Hebrew there are no special signs for numbers, but each letter of the alphabet has a numerical equivalent, and that means that every word has a numerical equivalent also.
Yes.
In the art of gematria, you divine serious things by reducing the appropriate word to their number equivalents, adding up those, then adding the integers of the sum again and again until you reach a number between 1 and 11. That number is the golden number and must be interpreted by knowledge of a very secret doctrine that embodies the rational pattern that lies beneath the seeming disorder of the universe.
Yes, said I, but how are you going to make that work with English words? Hebrew suppresses all the vowels but A, and lacks several of our letters.
That is part of the tradition. You fill in the gaps with Greek letters that also have numerical equivalents. Greek alchemists, Jewish alchemists, they work hand in glove. It really does work, you know. You want to try?
"I think you want to demonstrate your skill," said I. Of course I wanted to try, but obviously I was not deceiving him. He went off into a fit of laughter, almost silent, producing a small noise like someone crushing tissue paper.
"You do not trust me," he wheezed. "You think I am a magician, eh? And so I am, but not a false magician. I am a scientist, which is a modern magician. Long ago, when our university first began in 1572, they called me a black magician, and there are still some who make this sign against the evil eye when I pass them. But I wish you could trust me and let me be your friend, because I can help you greatly. Let us be friends in your Canadian manner. Call me Jesus."
There is a Puritan buried within me. I secretly determined not to call him Jesus if I could possibly avoid it. I took refuge in cunning. "I'll do better than that," I said. "I'll call you, Josh. Jesus is the same as Joshua, and the short name for Joshua is Josh. You see?"
"Oh, yeah. Oh, yes, I see,"
said he, and I knew that he saw right through me and was laughing at my Protestant distaste.
"Now, what shall we interpret, huh? This college, don't you think? What is its essence? What is at the root of it that will shape its destiny for centuries to come? And now wait! I must make myself ready." He sat very upright on my leather chair, his feet tucked under him, his eyes shut, and both his hands raised with the fingers extended. "Now," he said, "tell me the full name of this place, not too fast, so I can reduce it to numbers."
"Massey College in the University of Toronto," said I, and as I spoke his fingers began to flicker rapidly, as if he were tapping the keys of some invisible calculator, and indeed that is just what he was doing. I realized that I was looking at calculation as it had been during the Middle Ages, before the coming of cheap pencils and paper pads and adding machines and computers. He had turned his 10 fingers into an abacus, nor did he hesitate for an instant before he spoke.
17, 24, and 20, and 34, and 51 come to 146,
said he.
"Add up the integral of 1, 4, 6, it comes to, 11. Uh-oh, 11.
"Good or bad?" said I, far more anxious than I wanted to reveal.
"Magnifico! The number of revelation! The number of great teachers and visionaries in religion, science, politics, and the art. It is the number of those who live by the inner vision. Dangerous, mind you, for some time 11 loves ideas better than humanity, so that must be remembered and avoided. But what a golden number for a college! Oh, you need have no fears for this place."
"Thank you, Josh," I said. "You give me great hope. I am only sorry that I shall not be here to see its fulfillment."
"How long have you been here?"
said Professor Murphy. "It will be 18 years next June," said I, "but I began work on this place 20 years ago, on the 1st of January, 1960.
Uh-huh. Well, that date and the year and the date of your birth, add the integral, and it comes to 30. 3. That is very good, because 3 is your golden number also."
"How do you know?"
"Because I took trouble to find out before I came tonight. And I knew you for a 3 the minute I set eyes on you. So this is a happy
"Coincidence?" said I.
"There is no such thing as a coincidence," said Josh. "Not in Gematria. It is all part of the numerical pattern that governed the world. Yeah, you were a good man to begin this place, but not to continue it."
"Why?" I dreaded what he might say, but I had to know.
"Too flighty," said Josh. "Lots of imagination, lots of invention, but there is a limit to what those things can do in a place like this, a place with the great 11 as its golden number. You are not always and in all things wholly serious. You have what we biologists call jokey genes. It's high time you went. Who is to come next?"
"Professor Hume," said I. "You sat beside him upstairs."
"Oh, yes, and I felt a very strange thing coming from him. That is why I had to have vinegar. It was heating me up, and I needed to reduce my body temperature. Tell me his full name. And once again Josh took his calculating posture. James Nan Patterson Hume, said I. Josh made his rapid flickering calculation, and then to my horror gave a pathetic little squeak and collapsed sideways. Had Pat Hume killed him? But I saw one of the tiny hands gesturing toward the vinegar bottle which sat on the floor at his side. In an instant I put it to his lips, and he drank, until there was not a drop left. His eyes opened slowly, but one was looking aloft while the other looked down, and from his tiny body mounted an overpowering reek of vinegar. If he had been drinking anything else, I would have sworn he was drunk. But vinegar? I must know. Jesus, I whispered, shaking him gently. Jesus, are you pickled? He did not answer at once, but shook his head again and again, as if in wonderment. At last he spoke. This place must have a very special destiny, he said. Its golden number is the great 11, and that is splendor sufficient. But this Hume, this Jaime Nan Patterson Hume, his golden number is also despampanante, the great 11. Work it out for yourself. 14 plus 6 plus 41 plus 20. And what have you? How should I know, I said. I'm just one of your frivolous threes. I can't be expected to add in my head. What have you? Padulaque, analphabet! You have 92, and even you should see that when you add the integers, a 9 and 2, dog of a tree, you get 11. So this college, already shaped by 11, is now to have a master who is also an 11? And what will happen then? Oh, Romboso, Romboso! His eyes seemed fixed upon some rosy vision. What will happen? Tell me, I said, shaking him. Oh, do not ask me to tell, said Professor Murphy. Instead, why don't you join me in the great silent chamber of the immortal in the University at Bogota? And from time to time we shall come back here and behold with our own eyes the wonders that are sure to be brought forth. I was mystified. Great silent chamber of immortals, I said. You know of my work, said he. Am I not the prefectus of the Instituto Cironico of Bogota? I suppose so, said I, not very tactfully, but what's cryonics? Oh, you trees, you have the mind of ballet dancers. Cryonics, numbskull, is the science that will save mankind by preserving indefinitely the lives and the ability of people chosen for that purpose. It is achieved by a carefully calculated arrest of the cellular death, which eventually brings ordinary mortal to the point of physical and spiritual death. That arrest is managed by draining the body of most of its blood and substituting a formula for which ordinary vinegar may serve as a temporary substitute. Then the body is placed in a very cold chamber, and all its activity, but not its cellular life, are kept on ice, so to speak, until they are needed. Then a gradual melting out, and there's your man, practically as good as new, and in my case, more than 400 years old. Think what an accumulation of wisdom and experience that means. What we alchemists began so long ago as a search for the philosopher's stone was achieved in our Andean heights when we discovered, to hell with modesty, when I discovered that all that was needed was a sufficiently low temperature and plenty of vinegar. Now here is your chance, and you must be quick, for this evening has been an exhausting one for me. Will you fly back with me to Bogota? I promise you that in a week you will be emptied of your disgusting sick blood, and you will find yourself in a flask, reduced to the temperature of liquid nitrogen. All you have to do is leave a call at the desk, just like a motel, and in 100 years you will be shipped back here to see what this great college has achieved. I was tempted. I confess I was tempted. But I thought I should first talk the matter over with my wife. Later, when I had Professor Murphy's calculations checked by a Jewish scholar at one of the synagogues on Bathurst Street, I discovered that my wife is also a 3, just as I am myself, and it is unwise to neglect her opinion. May I have
till tomorrow to make up my mind," said I, and the professor's nod was so feeble that I became greatly alarmed about him. But we threes have substantial powers of improvisation. It was clear that the professor was so overcome by what he had found out about Massey College that he needed first aid, and of a special kind. So I did my unscientific best. Taking him in my arms, I carried him up the back stairs to the college kitchen. It was like carrying a wineskin, for the vinegar within him kept sloshing around most unaccountably. But I got him on one of the kitchen tables without having been seen during our wobbly progress through the college, and I undressed him right down to his skin. Former priest that he was, I was not surprised to find that he was wearing a tiny hair shirt, which is still in my possession, more or less, for Miss Whalen uses it as a tea-cosy. I managed to rouse him sufficiently to drink a couple of large beakers of vinegar, and then I brought jugs of ice water, doused him thoroughly, and tucked him up for the night on a shelf in our large walk-in refrigerator. In that embracing chill, he fell instantly into a childlike sleep, and so I left him. I went immediately to my wife and put the great question up to her. Was I to go to Bogota and a chilly life eternal, in order that from time to time I might return to Massey College and spy on what my successors were doing? She thought for a while and then said, "I wouldn't if I were you. Don't be a Massey College ghost. It would be most unbecoming. Don't you remember the line from our theatre days? Superfluous lags the veteran on the stage. When you have made your exit, take off your costume, clean the assumed character off your face, and leave the theatre." These were wise words, as I had expected them to be. So I went to bed, went to sleep, and forgot the whole matter. I was sharply reminded of it only last week, when we had our annual Christmas dance. A great feature of that affair is the buffet, which is a splendidly theatrical creation in which all the guests survey before they eat the miracles of cuisine that our chefs have prepared. Elegantly displayed turkeys, splendidly ornamented fish, jellies and potted meats pressed into fantastic and festive shapes, cream puffs filled with cream, so that their whiteness takes on the likeness of swans, wonderful little tartlets like jewels of topaz and ruby and emerald, cakes decorated in high baroque style that are themselves the epitome of Christmas, and happy youth and good cheer. As always, I looked at it with pride. This was just the sort of show to appeal to a man whose golden number is 3. And then, I don't want to continue. I'd much rather not. But there are imperatives of historical truth which even a 3 dare not brush aside. There, at the center of the main table, was... No, I say. Well, it was a roast suckling pig. At any rate, that was the way it was garnished. Certainly it had an apple in its mouth, and around the little eyes were outlines of white icing. Tips of pink icing extended its ears, which were not wholly pig-like. I looked hopefully between the markedly unpig-like buttocks for a curly tail, but there was none. Turning to our bursar, Colin Freeson, I said, controlling my voice as best I could, "That's unusual, isn't it? Where did you get it?" "Must have come in a big order," said he. "Nobody seems to know anything about it. It is a novelty. It's delicious. Vinegar cured, I should say. Try a bit of the crackling." But I declined. A flighty 3 I may perhaps be, but I can boast, as I hope all my successors will be able to boast, that I have never knowingly eaten a guest of this college.
For a catalog with more information about books on cassette, call 800-231-4261.